Tin Hi-Fi makes some interesting IEMs. They keep the majority of their offerings around $100 or less, which is fairly impressive. After all of their IEMs are made of sturdy metal, come with decent accessories, and have a sound signature that is, in my opinion, unique to Tin Hi-Fi. I have the T2, T2 Plus, and P1. While I've wanted to get the rest of the Tin Hi-Fi lineup, I have so many IEMs that I could not justify buying all of Tin Hi-Fi's products. But one of Tin Hi-Fi's products did catch my eye, and it's the T2 EVO. I recall when it came out, and it got some mixed reviews. Then the EVO fizzled out. I've always been intrigued by this IEM and only recently got the chance to try it out. Today, we're going to take a look at the T2 EVO, a $50 IEM. How does this product fit into the other Tin Hi-Fi lineup in the same price category? Tin Hi-Fi's marketing is pretty vague about what the EVO is supposed to do. They say that the EVO has bass that is, quote, moderate in sense of volume and sound driving and has a sufficient sense of dimension, creating a dynamic feeling and agreeable atmosphere, end quote. Tin Hi-Fi says that the EVO's rendition of vocals is, quote, slightly prominent in the medium frequency with moderate thickness and a somewhat cool feeling can be very helpful in shaping the sound profile, end quote. Tin Hi-Fi says that the treble is extremely smooth and agreeable. The EVO's overall tuning supposedly has, quote, more layers, and the loudness of human voices and music instruments is natural and real, producing a sound effect through a reasonable arrangement of music instruments, end quote. Frankly, all of this is just word salad as far as I'm concerned. The marketing is a jumble of nonsensical terms. But there is one statement which did make me laugh. Tin Hi-Fi says, quote, soprano, when tuned to a super high pitch, is likely to produce a slightly jarring sensation, but it does not affect the overall sound signature, end quote. In other words, brace yourself for high-pitched vocals. As with Tin Hi-Fi's other products, the EVO is built like a tank. In fact, Tin Hi-Fi calls this series of products the Tank family. The EVO has a build that is very similar to that of the original T2. At a passing glance, you might mistake one for the other. However, there are two differences. First, the EVO has a silver paint while the T2 is gray. Second, the EVO has red and blue indicators on the back of the IEMs while the T2 does not. The EVO comes with the same accessories as the T2, the same ear tips and the same kind of cable. If you've used the T2 or T2 Plus, then the EVO fits right in with them. The packaging is very similar across these three product ranges. As for comfort, the EVO is as comfortable as the T2. They fit the same and have similar weight. Using the supplied foam ear tips, the EVO sits securely in my ears. Even vigorous head shaking will not dislodge them. I can wear the EVO for about 2 hours before needing a break. Overall, the EVO has good build and accessories. As far as I'm concerned, Tin Hi-Fi does a very good job giving you what you need without frills, but also without sacrificing quality. In other words, if you were to compare the T2, T2 Plus, and EVO to the Blonde BL03 or 05S, you would immediately realize that the accessories of the former outshine those of the latter. Comfort on the EVO is agreeable. I prefer IEMs that sit within my ear canal, generally shaped to my ears. The EVO and T2 do not do that, but they're also easy to wear. In short, the EVO has no immediate issues with respect to build, accessories, or comfort. To test the EVO, I used them with various devices. This included my Modi Liquid Spark stack, the Army 80i2 DAC, the FIO M15, and my Flang P5. I use the stock accessories. I listen to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. You really don't need an amp for the EVO. If you plug these into your cell phone, assuming you still have one of those with a headphone jack, then you'll get plenty of volume. But if you want to use an amp, then rest assured a simple dongle DAC or a moderately powerful amp will provide an abundance of power for the EVO. Tin Hi-Fi says the bass is, well, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I can't understand their description, but in my experience, the EVO has a bass roll-off. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a sub-bass rumble from the beginning of the song. It's supposed to linger, ebb and flow throughout the track. The EVO did present the rumble, It was audible, but the transience was fast. Moreover, the reverberation did not linger. The sub-bass was underemphasized in my opinion. When the crescendo hit, the organ cut through the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was present, but clearly not fully recreated. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The EVO presented the sound of rolling marbles, but only some of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the EVO had no problems recreating all of them. Impact was slightly underemphasized. The drums did not reverberate, and transience was fairly quick. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. With each track, the EVO underemphasized the sub-bass. While I could hear the subwoofer effects, they sounded distant. It was like the subwoofer was at the other end of a large room, and there was a sheet in front of it absorbing some of the energy. Separation of sub-bass and mid-bass was clear. The drums were louder than the subwoofer effects, but still not impactful. Vocals stood out 2 steps ahead of instruments. Overall, the EVO's basses noticeably rolled off. I would not call it anemic, but it is clearly not a full presentation of this region. Bass heads will be deeply disappointed. Those who want a warm sound signature will find this IEM less than engaging. Tin Hi-Fi says that the mids have prominent vocals that give a cool feeling. I call this gibberish since I have no idea what this means. However, in my experience, the EVO appears to have forward mids with sibilant vocals. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there's natural vocal grain and sibilants mixed into the track. The EVO presented both details. The vocal grain was actually smooth and seemed to be fairly neutral. The sibilance, however, was emphasized. This was noticeably less than what you'd hear on the HT560S, which was a very harsh presentation in comparison. The drums seemed underemphasized and did not linger. There was good separation among the instruments. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of them. Timbre seemed to be correct. In Want You Back by Haim, the EVO again accentuated vocal sibilance. This emphasis was not harsh, but it was a deviation from neutral. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The EVO clearly presented this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, and the EVO clearly rendered their voices separately. When the instruments played at maximum, I could still easily hear all 3 vocalists. All instruments appeared to have true timbre. There was minimal melding among them. The drums had fast transients and seemed to be a little underemphasized. In Superposition by On the Giant, the EVO correctly presented the tonality of the ukulele, drums, and bass. However, it was evident that the bass was rolled off. Their primary male vocalist's voice was smooth. His sibilance was marginally accentuated. There's a backup vocalist in this track, his voice layered beneath the primaries. The EVO could not separate this detail, and this is typical of most headphones and IEMs I have tested. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The EVO had no problems recreating this detail. Overall, the EVO has forward mids. There is little to no bass bleed into the mids. Vocals are 2 steps ahead of instruments. Female vocals get a sibilance push. Male vocals tend to as well, but not quite as much. Regardless, this sibilance emphasis is above neutral, but noticeably less than what the HT560S does. The mids region is clear, and there is minimal melding among instruments. Tin Hi-Fi says that the treble is smooth and agreeable. Well, that depends on your definition of smooth and agreeable. In my view, the EVO has a treble emphasis from mid to high treble frequencies. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the EVO clearly articulated brass and horns. These instruments cut through the rest. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, their energy was also noticeably above neutral. This was not harsh or piercing, but the Alu S4X and Moondrop Quarks were more neutral by comparison. There was average instrument separation. I could hear group sets but not individual instruments. This was a stereo left and right presentation. There was no depth or verticality. In Flight from the City, the EVO made the piano sound like it was 8 feet away. The bassy notes were clearly underemphasized. Reverberation was faster than on the Quarks or the S4X. The cello was smooth and distinct from the piano. I could easily hear the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, creaking of wood, and shifting of the cello's weight. Some of these details were subtle, and the EVO did not struggle to present them. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the EVO presented the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass a few steps behind. The bass was underemphasized and did not interact or meld with the other instruments. The saxophone was louder on the EVO than on the Quarks and clearly outshined the piano and drums. It was not harsh or piercing, however. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in slightly varied tonality. The EVO did present this subtle detail. All the instruments were clear. Overall, the EVO has a treble emphasis. While I do not think it is harsh, your music and personal preference may give you a different perspective. The EVO is not a detail monster, but it does fairly well. I think it has above average performance in this regard. Subtle details are typically audible and clear. Obvious details should always be present. Pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, sharp intakes of breath, multiple vocalists, snapping of fingers, twang of guitar strings, different tonalities of cymbal strikes, these are all details that the EVO does not struggle to produce. When I speak of detail retrieval, I like to use a quantitative test. For me, this involves listening to the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Blonde BL03 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 presents 7 to 8. The T2 Plus and the Blonde BL05 present 6 to 7. The Heidi's MS2 present 8 to 9. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The The Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks provides 5 to 6. And the EVO produces 8 footsteps. I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performance in this test. Any result above or below their mark is judged accordingly. In that sense, the Blonde products would be below average. The T2 and Heidi's MS2 would be above average. I would place the EVO along with the T2. The EVO has above average detail retrieval. Ear tips make a big difference in soundstage experience. Insertion depth and your original recording are also major factors. Assuming you use the foam ear tips provided with the EVO, I think you'll experience above average soundstage. Let's compare soundstage of some other IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The Heidi's MS2 is similar to the T2 in this regard. The Blonde BL03 and BL05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based on proper fit. The Starfield and Aria and Quarks are about average. I would say that the EVO soundstage is comparable to that of the T2 and the T2 Plus. Tin Hi-Fi has a unique sound signature, I think. Either you like it or you hate it. The T2 was criticized for its lack of bass and its treble emphasis. The T2 Plus somewhat rectified these concerns, but not by a significant amount. If you are sensitive to treble or sibilants, then the T2 or T2 Plus would theoretically sound harsh and piercing. And because these IEMs have a bass roll-off, some might view the T2 and T2 Plus as having cold-sounding vocals. I think the EVO is very similar in sound signature to the other two T2s. It has a bass roll-off, it has a sibilance push, it has a treble emphasis. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Everything you've heard about the T2 and T2 Plus could be said for the EVO. If you are a basshead, I don't think Tin Hi-Fi makes products for your taste. If you want a warm sound signature, then the T2, T2 Plus, and EVO are the complete opposite. But if you want a more analytical sound signature, then these three IEMs might entice you. The EVO is not bass anemic, but you won't hear a full presentation of the bass region. And while vocals don't actually sound harsh, if you're sensitive to sibilants, you will have a hard time listening to some tracks that have sibilants recorded into them. I don't think the EVO or the T2 have what some people have called hot treble. None of the music I listen to or use or test cause the EVO to sound piercing in this regard. While the bass roll-off and treble emphasis might appear to be negative aspects, the EVO does have a few things that might entice you. For example, the EVO does have above average detail and soundstage, clarity and separation of instruments and vocals. If you want to listen to an IEM that helps reproduce subtle details, then the EVO may be to your liking. I think reviewers should do A/B comparisons as often as possible. That's the only way to put opinions into context. Here, we will compare the EVO to other IEMs. I decided to pit the EVO against the Moondrop Quarks, the Tin Hi-Fi T2, and the T2 Plus. I used stock accessories for all these products. I plugged them into my passive AB switch. That switch was connected to my Army ADI2 DAC and my Modi Liquid Spark stack. I tried to volume match. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Quarks undeniably have closer to neutral bass than the EVO. The Quarks have longer decay and greater melding between sub-bass and mid-bass. The EVO has more clarity in the bass region, however. Mid-bass slam is marginally harder on the Quarks. The mids are more neutral on the Quarks. The EVO accentuates sibilance, while the Quarks are noticeably closer to neutral. Vocal grain appears to be similar on both IEMs. Timbre of instruments seems identical, but clarity is greater on the EVO. Instrument and vocal separation is more noticeable on the EVO. Vocals are more intimate on the Quarks. The Quarks have more neutral treble. The EVO has an emphasis starting from the mid-treble region. The EVO is clearer and provides slightly greater separation. Treble instruments have more energy on the EVO. The Quarks present instruments closer to the ears. The EVO has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage. The T2 seems to have less sub-bass emphasis than the EVO. Transience is a little longer on the EVO. Clarity is similar, but the T2 appears to have a slight advantage in separating sub-bass from mid-bass. Mid-bass impact seems to be similar between these products. The EVO might have a slightly sharper rendition of drum strikes, but that's in minor degrees. The mids are similar in presentation. Both the T2 and EVO have a sibilance emphasis, and it appears to be about the same amount. However, the T2 presented vocals further ahead of instruments, more pronounced. The EVO in comparison made vocals appear a little further away, closer to the instruments. Timbre was the same, but the EVO had marginally longer decay of notes. The T2 had a little bit more clarity and separation. The T2's treble is perhaps just a slight bit more emphasized than the EVO. The difference is pretty slight. Separation of instruments tend to be a little clearer on the T2. Transient seems to be the same. Placement is the same. The EVO and T2 have very similar detail retrieval and soundstage. The T2 Plus and EVO seem to have similar bass response. Both have a slight emphasis compared to the T2. However, I think that the Plus has a slightly greater emphasis in mid-bass than the EVO. The EVO, however, seems to provide marginally greater separation of sub-bass from mid-bass. Mid-bass impact is a little sharper on the EVO. The mids are a little different between the Plus and EVO. Vocals seem to be less pronounced on the EVO. The Plus pushes vocals further ahead of instruments, similar to what the original T2 does. Sibilance emphasis seem to be identical. However, I think the Plus has a little bit more emphasis in vocal grain. Timbre was the same, but separation of instruments was marginally more obvious on the Plus. Treble is similar, but it appeared that the Plus had a smoother, slightly less emphasized treble response. The EVO had a bit more clarity in this region. Going back and forth, I could tell that the Plus has a slight roll-off in the upper treble compared to the EVO. Instruments placement was identical. Soundstage and detail retrieval was similar between the Plus and the EVO. Overall, you can tell that the EVO's tuning is directly related to the original T2. The Plus has the greatest amount of bass emphasis among these three IEMs, but that's not really saying much considering the T2 was never known as a bassy IEM to begin with. All three products have Tin Hi-Fi's notable vocal sibilance. The EVO and T2 have a treble emphasis that is a little greater than what you get on the Plus. Timbre is the same across the board. Placement of vocals and instruments is a little different, however. The EVO seems to push vocals back one step compared to the T2 and the T2 Plus. Tin Hi-Fi seemingly made minor alterations here and there among the T2 Plus and the EVO when compared to the original T2. The bottom line is that if you hate the T2, you will not be won over by its successors. If you like the T2 signature, then either the EVO or the T2 Plus might be appealing to you. We have a lot of options among IEMs. There's so many of them released every month that it's impossible to keep up. But some companies have a track record that entices us to keep an eye on their products. Moondrop, TRN, TFZ, and Tin Hi-Fi are among a few brands whose products, while not perfect, do tend to provide bang-for-your-buck options. The original T2 is somewhat divisive in an IEM standard. It does not have a warm, bassy signature that a lot of people seem to prefer, nor does it have a smooth vocal presentation, which might result in people feeling fatigued from the T2's mids presentation. The T2 Plus was supposed to be an alteration to the T2, and technically that's true. The Plus does increase the bass response, the mids are a little smoother, and treble is marginally reduced, but it's not a night and day experience. The EVO is, well, it's kind of a middle ground between the T2 and the T2 Plus. The EVO does have a slightly boosted bass response compared to the T2, but less than that of the Plus. While the Plus does have closer to neutral bass, it loses some of the clarity and separation of the T2. The EVO essentially is the middle ground. You get most of the T2's bass clarity and separation, but some of the bass emphasis from the Plus. The mids are different on the EVO. Vocals are a step back compared to the other two Tin Hi-Fi products. The EVO places vocals closer together with the instruments, which leads to less separation and clarity in the mids region when compared to the T2 and the T2 Plus. Vocal sibilance is pretty similar across the board. The T2 and EVO have similar treble emphasis. It's elevated, particularly in the mid to upper treble region. The T2 Plus, by contrast, has a slight roll-off. The T2 has the clearest rendition of treble, followed by the EVO, and the T2 Plus has the least clarity here. Detail and soundstage is about the same all across the board. When you take a step back and put the EVO into context, you get a fairly consistent picture. The EVO is a different version of the T2 with minor changes here and there. You don't exactly get the same tonality on the EVO as you would on the T2 or the T2 Plus, but you can tell all three are tuned by the same mind. This brings us to value. At $50, I think the EVO is in fact value. You get excellent build, good accessories, and a house sound signature we all understand. The EVO does not break new ground, but it does keep Tin Hi-Fi's characteristic emphasis on clarity and detail. Whether you will be happy with the Tin Hi-Fi sound is a personal matter. I don't think that the T2, T2 Plus, or EVO provide the greatest amount of detail in any IEM. Nor do I believe that these IEMs provide the widest soundstage of any IEM. But from the gamut of IEMs I have tested, these three tend to stand above average in these respects. I don't know if Tin Hi-Fi is interested in designing an IEM that has a warmer, more relaxed sound signature. Perhaps Tin Hi-Fi are happy with their sound signature and maybe they are working on something different. Whatever is going on behind the scenes, it's evident that they are committed to the T2 style of sound. The EVO is a moderate evolution of the T2 sound. It is not a revolution of the Tin Hi-Fi signature.